Well, hey everybody, welcome to, I don't actually know how to start this yet, so this is kind of just going to be a growing thing. I'm Andy. You know me from a bunch of other things on the Digital Church Network and the Church Digital Podcast Network, and to my left is actually somebody that you're going to get to know very, very well. Our good friend Ashley from XII Church, from a billion other things that are happening all over the internet. And Ashley and I have kind of teamed up to start this brand new venture we're calling the Hybrid Disciple. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a brief moment. But first off, Ashley, how has the day been? You just walked outside to get a tripod and you took your camera with you, and I saw this kind of bright, shiny, mystical day happening out there. How has the week been so far?
It's been a crazy busy week. I'm working to create a digital course on how to create content, and it's going to be used by an organization in Atlanta that basically empowers young people on operating in the digital space. And so that's been it's just been a busy week with that. And then my 4-year-old staged a coup in daycare, so that was fun.
It's swords and stuff too?
Well, he informed his teacher that he already knew everything he needed to know about the number 10. He's 4, and rallied his little troops and gathered them to go play trucks instead. And, I said, well, we can either celebrate his leadership abilities or, but also explaining that insurrection is not something that we are in favor of in daycare. So, it's just been one of those. It's been a week, but that's sort of my life. It's just always juggling things. So
there's a real Jean Valjean moment happening from Les Mis there, just standing on a rooftop screaming and singing. That's great. Does your 4-year-old, excuse me, does he normally have that type of attitude?
Yes, his name is Justice. His name is Justice. And, I told my mom after that happened, I said, he'll either be a mercenary or rule some small country in Central America. In the path that he's going, we got to figure out how to curb that for good. You can't rally your friends and convince them to not listen to the teacher. We're not doing that. But then the rebel in me that you all will get to know is kind of I feel that.
Yeah, boy.
You've already learned the number 10. I got it.
Yeah.
Cool.
It's the Spider-Man thing. It's, with great power comes great responsibility type stuff. Okay. So yeah. Ashley, you're creating a course, you're doing all this content and stuff, but you have a history. You've kind of got this heart for ministry. You have this incredible TikTok following. You have this kind of incredible eye for social media. You have really kind of a depth of artistry and a depth of knowledge that I think people need to know a little bit more about. So take us into your history just a little bit and kind of give us the 30,000 foot view of how you got to where you are today as we're recording this.
Yeah. 30,000 foot view. Well, I think probably what compelled me to go into ministry most is obviously I was rescued in a radical way by my relationship with God. So I was an escort for 5 years. I use the term escort because there's levels, and it doesn't make one better or worse than the other. You just put up with a different kind of nonsense depending on whether you're a streetwalker or an escort. But it's all prostitution essentially. So I was a prostitute for 5 years of my life. I'd grown up in a really idyllic situation. My mom and dad are Christ followers. They've been married for 46 years. They have a beautiful relationship. I had a really good childhood. There were some traumatic things that happened in my childhood that my parents didn't know anything about that definitely contributed to the path that I ultimately ended up taking. But it kind of baffles people because usually people think, well, if a person went to prostitution, they had a really rough childhood and, it was messy, and it wasn't. I tell people I just chose bad choices all by myself, just because it was what I felt like doing at the time. And so through that experience, through prostitution, first off, it put me in very close proximity with a mess of people who are trafficked and very, very broken, and women and men who just were really fighting uphill battles in their lives. And I spent a lot of time with those people. And so then in 2014, whenever I had just a transformational experience with Christ, I stopped escorting cold turkey, which is very difficult to do because I was making a lot of money and it's easy money. And so like that dynamic was difficult to step away from that. Additionally, something that a lot of people don't talk about whenever they leave the sex work industry is there is a dopamine rush that comes from the danger of what it is that you were doing. So while I was okay, I didn't want to escort anymore. Like I knew that I wanted to follow Christ and I knew I wanted him to change my life. But dopamine is a drug. Like it's a very real drug. Like some people get the hit eating cupcakes. I got the hit having dangerous sex with strangers. Like, but the brain compound is the same. And so it took a while for me to be able to really walk away from that. And I started going to therapy and I spent a ton of time in the Word. And if you listen to my TikTok content or anytime I preach, I talk about repenting in the Greek, because in Greek, the word repent means to change your mind. In Hebrew, it means to change your action, but in Greek, it means change your mind. And so really delving into that concept and understanding that we kind of have repentance almost backwards. We want people to change their actions first, but they've never really addressed the deep underlying thought processes and lies that they've believed about themselves so that their mindset changes, which would then ultimately result in their life and their actions changing. We don't really talk about that. And so through that process, I was like, okay, I'm getting to a point where I'm experiencing freedom and I'm experiencing breakthroughs and I am actually changing my life. What does that look like? And how do I carry water back into the burning building of the people that I left, right? And so that's sort of where the desire for ministry came from. I grew up in church. My mom and dad were the music ministers. I grew up in a Southern Baptist church, so it was like Wednesday night, Thursday night, Saturday night, Sunday morning. Like, I mean, I was in Awanas, scripture memorization, the whole thing. But I had a very Pharisee understanding of Jesus, right? It was all high level. And then whenever I actually encountered him in 2014, I was like, wow, this is a completely different thing altogether. And so, in conjunction with that, I've always been very artistic. And so my first kind of segue really into online presence was when Instagram became a thing. I loved it because I was able to take pictures from a very creative vantage point and share them with people. And it just sort of sparked something in me like, this is really fascinating to me. And I'm a data nerd. I love understanding the science behind things. I love understanding how the mathematical component of anything that's going on actually drives what's going on. And so I started working in marketing and learned coding and learned videography and learned photography and like all of that. Everything that you see that I do is all self-taught. Now I've taken a mess of courses, but initially, you know, I was like, oh, this is just a hobby. And then it became a real thing. And so I just kind of started eating and sleeping and breathing the internet. And then it just sort of all merged. I ended up getting to the point where I was being hired by churches. So I was on staff as a marketing director at XII Church in Detroit, Michigan. And then I moved back to Arizona, became the marketing media coordinator for First Institutional Baptist Church. And that was a really pivotal experience for me. The median age of that church is true story, like 70.
Oh.
The population of the church is very old. It's the oldest Black Baptist church in Arizona. It's been in existence for like 130 years. And the pastor, who I have immense respect for, has been the pastor there for over 40 years. But he was like, we've really got to figure out how to get young people into the church because they're not coming to church. And through my journey, I work with Urban Youth Workers Institute. in Long Beach, and they've done a ton of studies as to why young people are leaving the church, and again, the data behind that. And so I'm like, well, part of the reason is they don't feel like the church is relevant because the church isn't talking about relevant things. Another component of it is they don't feel comfortable in that space. Another component, they don't like the churches don't pay taxes. I mean, there's like a whole mess of things, right? But if you want a people group, an entire people group to engage with you, you have to listen to them.
Yep.
You can't just be like, that's ridiculous, and just keep going about your business. That's exactly how we've ended up where we're at, because the statistics are staggering. I mean, in Gen Z, only 22% of Generation Z believes that church or faith of any kind, so that's Christianity, Islam, Judaism, is relevant at all. Only 22%. And I think the number is 17% in the US believes that Christianity is the way to go. But if you break that down, even if you take the totality, 22%, and that doesn't mean 22% of them are involved. They just believe that it has relevance. So if you break that down further, and understand that if somebody says that something's important, only the statistic is only 4% of those people actually engage. Oh. So if you think 4% of 22% of an entire generation are actually engaging and participating in faith, that with those numbers in mind, they say that Christianity in North America will be completely obsolete by 2050. That's what the statistics say. Yeah. And so people don't like those numbers, and people don't want to acknowledge that those numbers exist. What you'll see is like, well, there's a bunch of kids in some state that are having a revival, and that's exciting. But just because that's what's highlighted does not mean that that is the accurate pulse of what is happening. And so, whenever he asked me, well, you've got to bring young people in, like, how are we going to do that? What I came up with was way, way too radical. He was like, I don't think that that's going to work. And so by this point, I was actually already in school at Grand Canyon University, getting a degree in biblical theology. I was already preaching all of the time at women's conferences. I was already very well versed in the art of online presence. And my dad said, well, why don't you just start a church that's digital? And I'm like, I am not starting a church. Like, that is not happening. That's the last thing that I'm doing, and
nobody wants to start a church.
No, that's probably true. And so, I was like, I'm not going to do that. My dad's like, I think you should pray about it. And I'm like, I'm not going to pray about it either. Like, I'm definitely not doing that. And I prayed about it, and and now 12 is almost 2 years old. So it went from an idea in my head in March to a full-on thing in June, the same year. I have a mentor that I respect a lot that lives in Detroit named Sonny Smith. And he's like, well, you need to have ideation time, and you need to figure out budget, and and that's just not my style at all. I was like, he's telling me this in like July. I'm like, oh, the first 4 episodes have already aired and we're just doing it. Yep. Like, I'm just doing it. Yep. And so I partnered with Warren Stewart, who had been a brick and mortar pastor for 10 years, as multiple seminary degrees. And, we worked together initially to get it up and running. And it just kind of took off. Like, our first year, we were in front of 147,000 unique IP addresses in 1 year, which was a huge number to me. I mean, whenever you compare it to brick and mortar, like, most churches don't have 147,000 people, yep, unique individuals that come through. And so that's sort of where it landed, The thing with 12 is, if you look at it, it's very grimy. It's very much a representation of the world that I came out of. Mm-hmm. The marketing components. Just so everyone understands, I now own a digital marketing consultancy, and I consult people all over the country on their digital marketing strategy. And then I also partner with a creative agency in LA that creates amazing content. They've directed things for the LA Opera. I mean, like a major production value. And so that's my world professionally. But then translating it into the church for me has been, it's very vulnerable, because if you look at 12, you're literally stepping into my head.
Yeah.
Like everything that you see on 12, I've either like taken the pictures myself, I write all the captions myself. I either film it and edit it myself or work very, very closely with someone else. So it's exactly what I see in my head that's being put out. But it doesn't look like church at all. Like there's no lilies and there's no doves and there's no light plumes. You know, we film in like burnouts and alleyways, and there's lots of graffiti and there's lots of dumpsters. And it's because my goal is to resonate with people that are like, you know, God is intriguing to me. Like I'm intrigued by God. I'm intrigued by this idea that I can be whole and feel loved through this guy called Jesus. But like the stereotypical traditional church stuff, I just can't get with that at all. Yeah. And so that's sort of what 12 has been birthed out of. And, you know, it's slowly growing. But, you know, I did hit a wall about this time last year where I'm like, I've lost my mind. Like, I don't think I can, you know, I don't think that I can do this. Like, I don't think that this makes any kind of sense. Like, why am I doing this? And I ran into a woman who I did not know at all. And she said, you know, you need to stop treating the call that God has on your life like it's a hobby, and you need to make it your life. And I was super convicted because I had definitely been treating it like a hobby. And so I, you know, asked God to forgive me of that. And then I had to do some repenting in the Greek and figure out what in my mind was like telling me that this wouldn't work, or telling me that this just wasn't viable, and really kind of reframe that and understand that on some level I still had sort of almost an idolatry worship toward the concept of traditionalism within church. Even though I was trying to do something that was so counter traditional, there's still that church girl in me that's like, this isn't really going to work.
Yep.
Like, it, and having to really delve into why did I believe that, and to reframe my mind. And so, we had our first in-person gathering 3 weeks ago, and I actually get kind of emotional when I think about it, because there were about 120 people there, and they were the exact people that I've been praying my face off for the last 2 years. I mean, it's like models and rappers and artists and muralists and LGBTQ and straight, and like this hodgepodge of all of the people that feel ostracized by the church, who were like, yeah, I'll go to this. And it was centered around a content creation day, and I was able to have amazing conversations with people and build relationship. And, you know, now I have people DMing me, asking me for prayer, and like, it's just opened up something that was my goal the whole time. But yeah, so that's, and then I'm also a mom, and I'm also writing a book, and I also, you know,
those things. Yeah, you know, the little side things. Well, there's a lot there, and there's about 1 million questions that I would love to ask you, and that I'm sure everyone listening to this is going to want to ask you, and we're going to have plenty of time for that, so trust me. But I want to kind of get our establishing shot here. You know, that's like the big thing. At the beginning of every movie, you have your establishing shot, just to kind of show everybody, or the beginning of every scene, you establish. And part of what we're establishing here with the Hybrid Disciple is going to be floating in between the worlds that Ashley and I both operate. I am a digital pastor for a physical church that has a very large digital presence. I'm also a digital pastor for a completely digital church. Ashley is a digital pastor for a completely digital church, and also floats in between all these different mediums. And the statistic you quoted there, that Christianity was going to be dead by 2050 if we don't really do something about it, is frightening, but it's also fascinating. And I think it's something that you and I and everybody that has quote unquote influence can speak into. And that's kind of what we want to do here on this show, is we want to speak into those points. We want to show you that, like, hey, it's not all bad. Like, we have steps we can take. And the biggest thing that we are commanded to do, obviously, as believers, is to go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the Holy Spirit. And we can get into all the semantics and Judea and whatever all that crap is. I don't really care about that part. I want to talk about the first part, and that's go and make disciples of all nations. Specifically, that word disciple. You can define it however you want. You can put your metrics all about it. But a disciple clearly is stated all throughout the Bible. It's someone who is walking close enough to Jesus to literally get the dust of the rabbi on them. I love that from John Mark Comer, passed down from Dallas Willard and John Ortberg. They're walking so close to Jesus. They're learning from Jesus. They're mimicking what Jesus did, so close to him that they're getting his dust on them. And it's this idea that, cool, we can do that, but typically you have to kind of do that in a physical context. How do we use the digital mediums that both Ashley and I are used to operating in, and then the physical mediums that we kind of have come from and that Ashley was there like 12 times every week growing up in? Like, how do we marry these things so that we can actually use a hybrid approach? So Ashley, when I kind of approached you about the show and we started ideating, what were some of the things that were kind of coming up as we were talking and as you were thinking about this whole concept and praying about all of this?
I would say first and foremost is getting people to understand that what community looks like has changed, and the way community is built has changed. It doesn't mean that the change has done away with the old or traditional way of building community. I think that component is still really important. But whenever you're speaking about young people specifically, people on the internet are just as real to them as people that are sitting across the table from them.
Yep.
And so to build community and to create a gathering doesn't necessarily have to be in person. And I think sometimes it's a really difficult thing for individuals to wrap their mind around. And it may be because they have never built a super strong relationship with somebody online, but people do it all the time. I mean, constantly. In fact, I have friends right now who I met through TikTok that I would consider to be like ride or die friends that I have never met in person ever. One of them, her name's Dallas Barbie. She runs a barbershop in Biloxi, Mississippi, runs an online church out of her barbershop on Monday nights. Firehouse chick, like the work that she's doing is bananas. And we text back and forth, like, pray for me with this, pray for that. I sit on her live. She sits on my lives. And she is 100% my friend. She is absolutely part of my community. But I've never been to Biloxi, Mississippi. She's never visited me here. Now, of course, that's the goal ultimately. But I think that one of the things that came up for me is really just like, how do you educate people on the power of community that's built digitally and getting that. But then the flip side of that is getting people to understand that tangible touch component is really important as well.
Yep.
And I'm definitely not negating that. Like, one of my favorite stories about Jesus in the Bible is whenever he touched the leper and the leper was healed. He could have just spoken to the leper and the leper would have been healed. But what we have to understand is that leper had spent who knows how many years completely ostracized and hadn't been touched at all. And so when Jesus touched him to heal him, yes, he took the obvious disease away, like the leprosy was gone, but it also, I believe, healed something inside of him because he hadn't been touched. And so understanding that element is still important, that touch component is still important, and sort of understanding and hashing out, how do we break down the territorialism within the body of Christ that says, because I have a digital only church, that the people that follow and engage with my digital only content are my people. I'm never going to have, never, I say this and God will be like, Ashley, you need to move to Idaho. But I'm never going to have a church in Boise, Idaho. Like I'm just not. Like, that's not what God has called me to do. Please do not call me to Boise.
Dear God.
Dear God. But, I'm never going to have a church in Boise, Idaho. So I have to get out of this mentality that these people are my people.
Yeah.
And understand, what needs to happen? I need to find a church in Boise, Idaho that has banging theology, that is supportive, that has stuff that if a person says, Ashley, I love 12, I'm going to continue engaging in 12, but I really would like to be able to have somebody pray with me and hug them at the end of it. Okay, great. Well, go to this church. Here's the pastor, and break down that territorialism. So I think that those are probably the two things, is educating people on how to build relationships where you're walking alongside someone and you're discipling them day in, day out through the internet, but then also celebrating and uplifting the understanding that touch is important. And there is something to be said about proximity, and really, really delving into this idea in the church that, this side of the street are my people, that side of the street are your people, because that's clearly not working. And being willing to say, go to First Faith Christian Center in Phoenix because they're amazing people and they're going to be able to help you with this in a capacity that I'm not, and not getting weird and territorial about it. Those are a couple. There's been lots of things that have come up while I've been praying, but I would say that those are a couple of the big ones for me.
Well, and that kind of speaks into what I kind of want to accomplish with this show as well. Having you as an expert in, and I'm putting expert in scare quotes, but also in real quotes. You are the expert in marketing, in influencer kind of relationships, but also like being an influencer yourself. Because like it or not, you have built a platform via 12 and via your TikTok, and it's beautiful and wonderful. And like you said earlier, it comes straight from your head into your eyes and then like out into your social media accounts. And that's beautiful because you are literally doing what God did when he created the world in 6 days and then rested. Like you have the vision, you have the thing, and you're just breathing it out there. And that is a skill that not a lot of people have, but a lot of people want, and a lot of people think they have it. And so like, how do we take the diamond of like, hey, you might not be an influencer, you might not have like the beautiful touch that Ashley and kind of her cohorts have. How do we take that and whatever platform and whatever influence that they do have in a digital capacity, and then add that physical component to it so that we can actually help people grow in their relationships, ultimately affecting them, not for our own followings, for our own likes and subscribers and our own follows and any other money thing we want to put to it, but for the sake of the kingdom, because that's ultimately what's going to make this all grow. We know beyond knowing that Jesus wins in the end. Like, yes. I've read the end of the book. Ashley's read the end of the book. Like, we get it. Jesus is going to win, but also we are commanded to like live in that tension of, okay, Jesus is going to win, but also we have to do something about this. And so this entire show is dedicated to that. We're going to have conversations about that. We're going to have guests that are going to be kind of speaking to that. We're going to give practical tips. We're going to give analysis. We're going to kind of hit on current events happening. There's actually some interesting things happening right now in a lot of churches as they're finding out that their social media accounts are no longer just like announcement pieces, like, bulletins. And like, there's a weird, and I don't know if you're feeling this, so we can kind of schedule this for another episode, but like, there's a weird sort of like, it's kind of getting cringy for a lot of it. I mean, it's been cringy for years. Let's call a spade a spade.
Yeah.
But like, some of that stuff is like churches transitioning out of like, hey, we got our Wednesday night group thing, and like they're trying to do the thing, but like it's just it's awful, and like I think they're squandering their influence a little bit. So like, how can we help them, and then how can we also help the person that is in Maryland who has 300 people that meets on a Sunday, scattered all across the country, all across the world? How can we help them physically start to make disciples? So I'm super excited as we kind of round the bend here, Ashley. I'm looking forward to this. Any other tips or tricks or any kind of little nuggets you want to add before we close up shop today?
Yeah, I would just say that if you are you work closely with the church or you don't, and you just have a heart for Jesus, and you want to use your platforms in a way to influence people toward him, I think the first thing that I just want to remind people is we're all influencers. Anyone, we all have influence over someone. And so you may not have tens of thousands of followers on TikTok like I do, but that doesn't mean that you are not influencing someone. And so I would say that first and foremost, just always keep in mind that you can, in an instant, completely change someone's life and you don't even know it, provided that you are brave enough to be authentic. And I think the missing component whenever you're speaking of the cringiness is there's this thought process sometimes that you've got to put things out there that are perfect and beautiful, and there's a space for that, absolutely. But what young people especially want right now is authenticity. They don't care if you have all your makeup on. They don't care. They want you to be real about your story and what God has brought you through, and allow them to see like the sanctification process of Christ in your life, because that authenticity really resonates. So I would say from that perspective, as you move forward and you're utilizing any online platform, whether it's from a ministry vantage point or just as an individual, is don't be afraid to lean into your mess. Because it's through that people feel connected to you. And that connection is what ultimately leads to relationship. And relationship is the only way that you can disciple anyone. Otherwise, you're just a judgmental douchebag. And you're like swatting people, the head, and that's not disciple making. Like, that's not hybrid disciple. That's I don't know what that is.
That's called being old school, and unfortunately, that's how we drive people out of the church. You heard it here first, folks, or however you're listening to this, either on YouTube or on any of our socials or via podcast. You heard it here first. Don't be cringy. Show people your mess, or else you're going to be a gigantic, judgmental jerk.
Yes. And that's the summary.
Hey, that's going in the show notes. I appreciate that. Hey, everybody, thanks so much for tuning into the intro here. We're going to be finding a regular rhythm. We're going to be finding a regular everything. We're going to be exploring the space a little bit. There is going to be contact information in the show notes if you are listening, and in the doodly-doos below, in the comments and all the things below. To get in touch with us. Also, you can follow Ashley on all of her things. All of those links are going to be below. Please, please, please go shoot her follows and give her all the likes and all the hearts on everything that she's doing with 12 and her own personal stuff, because honestly, it is one of the reasons that I wanted to work with her after we got involved, hooked up by our mutual friend, Jeff Reed. Shout out to Jeff. I had been stalking 12 Church's stuff for a while, and I was like, oh gosh, this is brilliant. So Ashley, super looking forward to this. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you.